Hi. Sorry the audio was a little crappy on the live version, so I thought I'd send my comments sort of condensed and synthesized this way, this time with less hair. Anyway, thanks very much for having me and sticking with me. I want to talk a little bit about new librarianship in rural libraries. And I'm going to begin in a sort of seemingly odd place, which is that you're at a library conference, and I want to start with what is a library? Now, I did a little Google searching and image searching, looked around, and I found that the answer is hard to define by the buildings that we're in, whether they're big buildings or little buildings in other places of commerce or hidden behind trees, things like that. Trying to define a library by its physical locality, by its collection, by what it looks like, what the signage is like, just doesn't work too well in Alberta and frankly nowhere else in the world. Every community is different, every community builds it in a different place, has different opportunities. So trying to figure out what a library is by the buildings we're in doesn't work very well. But we do know something about physical buildings of libraries. We know that there is a changing nature to these libraries. Libraries have gone from quiet buildings with loud rooms to loud buildings with quiet rooms. It used to be the idea that we really lived up to the shushing reputation. When people came in, it was a haven, it was a quiet place to go read and study and contemplate. 100 years ago, large libraries, particularly in urban centers, were places of quiet reflection with large reading rooms and large desks to work on. Now, this has changed a bit, right? It used to be you always did sort of loud services over in the corner or after hours, things like that. But now we brought those front and center. Now we have lectures and we have people doing reading groups and reading discussions. We have people tutoring and meeting with each other all the time. We've introduced cafes and places to socialize and really look at it as much more of a community center. And we have quiet rooms set aside for people who want the quiet reflection, but the building itself tends to be a pretty loud place. They've also changed from places of knowledge access to places of knowledge creation. So at one point, the idea is that we would go into a library and we would get access to great works, great understandings, visions of other people's stories, locations, ideas, etc. And that's still true, but I think Joan Fry Williams, one of my favorite thinkers, put it really well. She said, we need to stop thinking of the library as a grocery store and start thinking of it as a kitchen. That is, instead of going to a library, finding what you want, picking and checking out the books, and going somewhere else to do the work of synthesis, we can all begin to do that in the library. Now, we've had people do that where they've been writing books or creating genealogies, but how much have we supported the library creation process? Do we allow for podcasting? Do we have craft area? Do we provide places to write books, book-on-demand services? Do we have places to produce music? Do we provide forums for speakers? Do we capture that and podcast and video it out? Do we send it streaming around the world? The library has always been part of a knowledge creation process. But increasingly, the public libraries and academic libraries and all sorts of libraries are becoming a place where we support the actual creation process right within the facility. We give out carrels and workrooms. Many places are creating sort of entrepreneurship centers. So at Dallas Public Library, they cleared out most of a floor and they put in work desks and whiteboards, and they're putting in monitors, and they're going to have secure storage. We talk about places where they can pitch venture capitalists, where they can bring in lawyers and accountants to come help these startup companies. And we can see that in writing workshops. We can see that in, once again, tutoring services. We can see that in teen centers where they're doing gaming. So it's a place where people come to learn and build products right there in the library. And so it's not a matter of sort of, here's all the stuff you need, now go somewhere else and create it. And if you create something really good, bring it back and we'll put it on a shelf. This is the point of creation. This is a living laboratory. The libraries have become community laboratories of knowledge, places where people get together, try out ideas, try creation, try new ways of doing things. This has really led to the major shift in libraries, and particularly public libraries, but libraries of all types, which is the library used to be the territory of the librarian. It was kind of like all the tools that we needed to do our work. And now it's really becoming the territory of the community. As the tools that we use become more virtual, more distributed, smaller, lighter, more portable, mobile, etc., then what we used to build and have to have around us in terms of infrastructure has gone down. Now, that could mean downsizing libraries and taking rooms back, taking spaces back. In many school libraries, for example, as the encyclopedias, which used to take up all the shelving, got replaced with a computer with, at one point, a CD and now internet access, the idea was, well, we don't need all this room for encyclopedias anymore, we'll put more classrooms and etc. And many inactive school librarians said, wait, take away those encyclopedias, please, 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 but leave us the space so that we can have study rooms, so that we can have areas to work, so we can do small group projects, things of that nature. So the idea is that this territory is now much more of a community space. As libraries have needed that space less because of digital resources, the communities need it more, and it's a great combination because libraries are of the community. They provide that. So this changing nature of the physical library can also be seen in certain things like the shift of ownership models from rental to a rental model in collections. Right? It used to be that we would buy stuff, we would own the stuff, we would circulate the stuff, but it was our stuff, we'd preserve it, etc. But with the advent of digital media in particular, we've moved from the idea of buying stuff to leasing and licensing stuff. We now have databases. Some of our most used resources are electronic that we have no ownership of. If we run out of money to pay the license fee next year, it's gone. That kind of has led to consortia buying, where consortia provide that, but even then, now we've sort of had to compromise each individual collection development policy. And so when we look at ebooks and we complain the fact that we don't own the ebooks or that the publishers don't get us, the truth is that we've been living in this world for quite some time. And we also have an area of peaking collections, which means if you look at your circulation stats, they're no longer going like that, they're starting to level off a bit. And in fact, in many localities, we're starting to see collections decline. In academic libraries, we see declines over major sectors, from reference work to bodies to circulation. In public libraries, we're not seeing the drastic declines, but we are seeing a level off. And so this means that the library built around a physical collection, we need to sort of spend some time thinking about that. So what I want to propose to you is, rather than defining libraries as a place, rather than defining libraries as a collection, rather than defining libraries as a sort of physical infrastructure, let's instead think about a new way to define a library, and that is that a library is the infrastructure and tools shared with the community, but maintained by a library. In other words, by a librarian. In other words, the library is really what it takes for a librarian to do their work. That in that case, what buildings look like doesn't matter. It's the presence of a librarian. In collection development, in how we think of it, it really is that which is created through this lens of librarianship. Now, this leads to, in Alberta in particular, a really important question, which is, how do we define a librarian? Because potentially, I just excluded a big number of you if I said, oh, that only is people who have a degree. Well, what is a librarian? Is it someone who has the Masters of Library Science? Is it someone who has a job title? Is it someone who went through an apprenticeship system? Is it someone, what is a librarian? And can you have a librarian without a library? And I think this becomes really important, because if you define things just by the MLS, we have plenty of folks who are running libraries today doing a brilliant job of it that don't count, and that's wrong. On the same token, if you define it as people who work in a library, we have a bunch of opportunity that we're about to miss. We're about to miss all those folks who have a background, education, a tool set, a worldview that really complement and enhance librarianship, that are leaving the buildings to go be embedded within corporations, embedded within communities, embedded all over the world. And I don't think we want to exclude those folks as well. So what I want to do is give you a little bit of my definition of what makes a librarian, and from that talk about how it's going to really sort of change what we're doing. So for me, there are three factors that define librarianship, and there's lots of ways to get there. The first factor is our understanding of knowledge, that we're in the knowledge business, that as librarians, what we seek to do is to enhance and help facilitate people creating knowledge. Right? We're not in the thing business, we're not in the book building, we're not in the maintenance business, we're not in the party planning business, we're really in the knowledge business. Books and DVDs and licenses and even the building. These are simply tools to help us do our job. We really need to focus on how people learn. The second thing that I think helps define librarians is our modes of facilitation, how we go about helping people create knowledge. Excuse Excuse me. And so this is where, we'll talk about what they are in a few moments, but our job as librarians is not necessarily to create knowledge in the sense of we do it ourselves, right? I don't envision a library where we have a bunch of people with Bunsen burners and, large particle colliders and thinking up brilliant thoughts, but our job is to help our communities discover new ways, better ways of making decisions, of understanding themselves through fiction, of coming up with the next invention of economic development. We are really the handmaidens of innovation in that case. And the last thing to define us, because there are many people in the knowledge business, teachers, journalists, publishers. There are many people in the facilitation business, from Google helping people find things to hosting blogs. But the third thing really uniquely identifies us when you put them all together, and that's our values. The things that we believe in, the non-negotiables in which we walk into a community and say, really, these are important to us and they should be important to you as a community. Privacy, these kinds of things. So, in fact, let me break those out a little bit. So what do I mean by knowledge? Well, knowledge, if you look at learning theory, and there's lots of different theories and such that call it slightly different things. The one I like is something called conversation theory, but short term is knowledge is created through conversation. When we're learning, we're engaged in a learning conversation, and that conversation may be with the person sitting next to you across the street, it may be with an instructor or teacher, it may be between two organizations, it may be between two countries, and it may be, and often is, with yourself. In other words, when you're having a conversation, when you're reading a book, you're not having a discussion with the book. It's a bunch of dead trees, or these days, pixels on a screen. Right? You're not having a conversation with the author. They could be long dead. You're really having a conversation with yourself, where you're sitting there and going, all right, as I'm reading this, do I understand this? How does that relate to what I already know? Do I agree? Do I disagree? And we're really having an internal conversation all the time. Right? And we're exchanging language back and forth. Do we have common language, etc.? And we're seeking agreements. I agree with this. This makes sense. Oh, I don't agree with that. One of the most important agreements you can come up with is agreeing to disagree. And lastly, a memory, which is over time remembering what we understand. So as we encounter new situations, new people, new things, we can bring that whole world of experience back to us, and we can apply it. Right? So really, if you think about it, knowledge is not some static thing. You can't write it into a book. You can't record it. You can't communicate it directly. It's uniquely human. It's uniquely what's in our brain, because we have an image of the world, and we may communicate that, and people may build that up in theirs, but it's going to be slightly unique to each other. So understanding how to facilitate conversations is really what librarianship is about. You don't need a master's degree to do that, though in the master's programs we help people learn that, but you do it because this is how you work. Right? So a lot of knowledge is getting out of the building and out behind the desk and talking to people and saying, what do you need to know? What's going on? What do you already know? What have you looked at? Having a conversation back and forth. So how do we facilitate knowledge creation? Well, really 4 major ways. The first is access, and we're really good at that. Right? The idea that we provide access to conversations, or we provide access to resources and materials that enhance a conversation, like books and web pages and DVDs and such. And once again, I want to be really clear. These conversations, these learning conversations, can be in fiction. It can be learning about what we like, learning about ourselves, learning what entertains us, as well as learning 2 + 2 = 4, etc. So access. And even that, access is a very interesting world. So, we'll get to that in a second. The other is base knowledge, which is if you're getting people to access to these conversations, they need to know something. For example, is the conversation on the net? They need some computer literacy skills. Is the conversation in Spanish? They probably need to learn Spanish. So what is it that we can provide in terms of instruction, of allowing people to then encounter and work with this different conversations? An environment where people feel safe to do that. In many public libraries, that's physical safety. What do they do after school? But it's also intellectual safety. What I look at and where I look at it, and I feel free to do that so that not everyone's looking behind my shoulder and guessing why I'm looking at that. I have a freedom to go out into that world. So in terms of environment for a moment, once again, Corinne Hill at the Dallas Public Library had a really interesting comment on the panel. She said, what we're doing is we're redesigning our spaces, and we're putting the books around the outside and the collaborative space in the middle. We're putting the books around the outside like artwork. Now, one could read that as a sort of dismissive statement, but if you do, you say, oh, they're just using it as decoration, then you don't really understand art. right? Art, in its highest form, is meant to challenge, to educate, to inspire. Art is really another form of dialogue. It's a visual language that helps us communicate. So those books around the outside are not just there to be pretty. They're there for the people in the midst to collaborate, to refer to look at, to check, to read, to inspire them to develop what's new. And the last thing we need to do if we're going to facilitate conversations, facilitate knowledge, is we must understand what's motivating this. What's the driver behind an individual or community? Are they seeking economic development, self-actualization? Are they doing it for themselves, or are they doing it for someone else? What is it, and how can we tie into that motivation? And in terms of our values, they include learning. Right? As librarians, we value learning. We believe that learning happens in the most open environment possible. Right? So learning and openness, that as librarians, we feel that the best decisions are made in the presence of the most diverse information sources available. More and more and more information made reasonable, understandable, and connected to what you're doing, but diversity is important. And we believe in intellectual freedom and safety. We believe in that environment side. We believe that people need to be able to look around at these multiple sources and feel comfortable in doing it. Now, notice what's not there is unbiased. So I believe that librarians cannot be unbiased. I believe no one in the world can be unbiased. The color of your skin, where you were born, your nationality, the language that you use, all of these built-in bias. Right? When someone asks you a question, whether you head to the computer first or look for a book first, you're showing a bias. As librarians, what we're trained to do is not be unbiased, but to acknowledge our biases and, where possible, set them aside, or at least acknowledge and try and control for them. So we're intellectually honest. So this is what sort of makes up librarianship. We understand about knowledge, we understand the means of facilitating that knowledge creation, and we do it in a really strong value statement. But that's sort of where we are. That's a sort of is statement. What we do with that, where do we go, that's part of a mission statement. So the mission of a librarian is to improve society through facilitating knowledge creation in their communities. Right? Our job is to make a community better. Is to, first of all, that facilitation word, to work within the community. But why are we doing this? Now, I've had some online debates about improved society. I'm not quite sure who can be against improved society, but there are some people who have some rightful things to say. For example, if improved society means librarians have the right way that society should be and we move forward and enforce that, that's not what I mean. Right? Improved society is part of this conversation with the community. It means that we walk into the community and we say, what do you want? What do you need? Where do you want to be? But as a conversation, there are always two parties in a conversation. Right? There's two views, or else it's not a conversation, it's a monologue. Right? So we enter into the conversation and we understand that as participants in that conversation, we are both shaped by the conversation and we shape the conversation. When someone comes and asks you for a book or a reference question, the fact that you have it or don't have it shapes what they're going to be able to do. The information you give them and how you give them, how friendly you are, or how mean you are, or if you snicker when you hand over the book, all of this shapes that conversation. And so when we go to this community, when we go to our communities that we are a part of and a member of and therefore must have a say in, and say, what do you want to be? There are certain things that we're not willing to go down that road. If what we want to be is a service and surveillance system for youth where we bring our children and everything that they do and think and see and babysit them, we as librarians say that's not librarianship, that's not our role. So we have to have a strong foundation in that improved side. Right? And then once again, how do we facilitate knowledge creation? Through access and base knowledge and environment and motivation. What do we mean by knowledge? It's a conversation. So for me, that's the definition of a librarian. It's someone who understands and facilitates knowledge. It's someone who does that in a strong value system and does it ultimately to make our society, community by community, person by person, member by member, better. Right? We're optimists. Librarianship is an optimistic field. It is one that believes that there is always room for improvement, and that improvement comes through empowering the community to meet their needs and unlock their passions. Now, before I get too much further, I'm getting there, I do want to talk a little bit about the rural aspect, because I think that sometimes the discussion is, all right, great, so we're going to do all this facilitating and enhancing. It's not all the books and materials, but I have one room. I have people that have to drive 20 minutes to get to me. I'm out in a place that isn't going to have broadband to every square millimeter of what I'm doing. So clearly I can't do this, right? So facilitating knowledge and podcasting, all that stuff, that's someone else's problem. And I disagree completely. I think that the first thing you have to understand is you have an advantage of size, that in smaller libraries we have great advantages, one of which being innovation. One of which is if we decide we want to change and offer new services, we have to have very few conversations among the core people about what we want to be. We don't have 50 people that we have to move through a committee. We can say the library is enhancing its electronic access, its knowledge creation process, etc. We can move quickly on that. We're not weighed down by a huge collection. We're not weighed down by a huge bureaucracy. We have the ability, and we have the ability to get into our communities. We know the people who walk through the door. We understand what they need. We have an intimate relationship with those folks, and so we can have a conversation about what do we want to be and what does the library need to be to make that happen. I think the idea that we need to wait for the large rural or large urban library or the large academic library, the large whatever to figure this out because they got money, I think is crazy. I think we have, as rural libraries, the ability to move much faster, the ability to try things faster, the tight connection with the community and a built-up trust personally, on the personal level, to say, did it work? How about this? Let's try that. And so we need to get into that community. We need to be able to move fast. And ultimately what we need to do is go to the conversation. So this is a picture of the Glendale Public Library in Glendale, Ohio, where I grew up. If you look on Google Maps, it's like highway, development, factory, big area of trees. That's Glendale, right? It's a rather affluent suburban library. And there are a bunch of libraries within 10 minutes drive of it, but they decided as the Glendale community they wanted to have their own library because communities have public libraries and that's what they wanted. In fact, they took over this community center, which actually used to be a library, and made it. And what they did is they knocked on doors and they said, hey, got used books, donate some books to the library. And they did. They got a nice collection of used books. They opened up the library. The first day, lots of people showed up. By the fifth day, no one was showing up. And can we really blame them? Right? What were we saying? Come to the library. Leave your home and come to us to look for books that you've already read. Right? Yeah, doesn't necessarily make that much sense. Imagine instead that when they were going and knocking on the doors, instead of asking for their used books, they said, what's your problem? What are you trying to deal with? What's going on? How can I help you? They might find a lot of people living with mortgages that they're underwater in, mortgages that they can't afford. They're probably dealing with job issues, underemployment, layoffs. They're dealing with education issues for their children. They're dealing with a population that is aging and trying to bring in younger folks into the community and get them involved. They're dealing with land use issues. They're dealing with, property rights issues. They're dealing with development. They're dealing with the whole range of things. What if the library went out to them and said, what do you need? And then they said, all right, well, we have a space, come meet on this topic. Or, hey, we should go find those materials. Or, hey, could you come and help us on this? In other words, instead of the idea of a library is a place with books, give us your books, they said a library is a facilitated conversation about how to improve our community. What do you need? Now, we have skills, right? But it used to be if you wanted to bring the library to someone, if you wanted to go have that kitchen conversation, you needed to have one of these. You need to put a diesel engine in front of it. And we drive out to our communities and we'd say, here's the resources and it's the books and materials. And we sort of bring the materials to them. Now what it takes to bring a conversation to someone is something like this. This is a 4G modem. It works off of cellular networks. By the way, there are satellite equivalents of this, so that we could literally sit in people's kitchens and say, hey, let's look for this. Hey, here's a resource. Here's a database that we just subscribed to. Here is a government agency and what they provide. And use the skills of librarians to facilitate a conversation, even though the resources may not be physically behind us, they're virtually available to us. There still will probably be a core collection, right? There's still a need and a reason for a core collection in a physical facility, but it's in service of solving these other problems. And by the way, this is another bookmobile example, except you'll notice instead of books, what it's got is it's got a bunch of stuff inside of it and a satellite dish on the top. Increasingly, the new bookmobiles going out to rural areas, going out to hard-to-access areas are not bringing physical items, they're bringing connectivity. They're bringing Get Connected. We're going to come on the monthly internet run or the weekly internet run, and we'll bring the resources along. And if you've got resources to donate, we'll help circulate those around the collection as well. The point here is that if we begin to look at the library as the infrastructure of a librarian, and the librarian as someone whose ultimate skills are to facilitate knowledge creation, then, in a very value-rich environment, then we can really begin to design and look differently. And our rural communities desperately need us to do that. Right? They desperately need access where they are. When they're talking about issues of agriculture, when they're talking about issues of energy exploration, when they're talking about lease issues, when they're talking about children growing up and moving away, when they're talking about population shifts, when they're talking about the moves to urban areas, that conversation needs to happen lots of different places, and someone needs to be there to facilitate it and do it in a value-rich way where people don't feel like they have an axe to grind or a political agenda to bring to them, and that is librarianship. People need librarians now more than ever. They need our skills and they need our background to do it. So Andrew Carnegie, who built libraries around the world, he's sort of famous for saying this about libraries, right? It's not such a cradle of democracy upon the earth as the free public library. It's a republic of letter where neither rank, office, nor wealth receive slightest consideration. That's a great, wonderful, aspirational quote. But it's not my favorite Carnegie quote. This is my favorite Carnegie quote. Take away my people, but leave my factories, and soon grass will grow on the factory floors. Take away my factories, but leave my people, and soon we will have a new and better factory. For Carnegie, the center of production, the center of wealth development, the center of action was not infrastructure, it was individuals. It was not buildings, it was people. It was labor, it was getting down and working. It was the idea of production and innovation of new ideas. As we look at our libraries, as we deal with budgets and we deal with recessions, and as we deal with rural environments, as we deal with people moving to urban systems, as we deal with real big problems, it is not the beauty of our building or the collections that are going to make that happen. It is also not some sort of monolithic view of a library and what it looks like that's going to make it happen. It's librarians looking very much like that community, connected to a strong core of librarianship and service and being able to talk, but within the community looking absolutely unique. That as librarians, we are going to come in the form that you need us, that we are going to look like you, that we are going to work on your problems. And if a collection solves that, we'll work on the collection. And if databases solve it, we'll work on databases. But if a conversation with me or your neighbor or a friend is going to help it, I'm going to make that happen. If what you need is a blog where you can let your views be known and communicate around the world, if what you need is a forum for writing your next book, if what you need is a place to come up with your history and understand your place in the world, if what you need is a forum to discuss public policy, the library is a place to do it. Meaning, the librarian created infrastructure, that we curate that environment that happens in, that we facilitate participation, that we grow participation, that we enhance participation, and that's ultimately the power of librarianship. Thank you very much.